Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill. It's about that time, getting to the end of October. Time to open up the college football playoff conversation, giving my best stab at what I think the college football playoffs will look like come the month of December. Look, this is going to change a lot over the next couple of weeks. And I think most importantly, before we even get into it, let it fly in the comment section. I think there are so many different ways, and I'm sure plenty are looking at this poorly made graphic of mine and saying, I got some problems. That's the beauty of doing this. So let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The support's been amazing. Appreciate you guys. And Dill, without further ado, let's get into this. And it's kind of a blend between, what teams do I really like and what teams do I think will have a lot of success come the month of November, back half of the season, but also like you're trying to put together like pathways that all these teams have to get to the college football playoffs. And that's where it gets difficult. My head was absolutely spinning. Now let's simplify it first. Let's talk about the teams that win their conference championships. Let's start in the Big Ten. Oregon coming in as the number one seed. I think Oregon and Ohio State are in my mind, the two teams you're looking for in the Big Ten, with Penn State certainly being that dark horse. And Dill,
Thank
I think
you.
a lot of Penn State look, I think a lot of Penn State fans would probably agree. Like, we want to see it happen before we're like going to clamor. That being said, this Penn State team feels totally different with Coach Kolnicki taking over the offense. The reason I'm sticking with Oregon, one, I think they're starting to play their best football. They're starting to play to what the talent on the roster says it should play at. And then number two, I look at Ohio State and say that game easily could have gone either way. Losing your left tackle midway through the season, that makes me nervous for Ohio State. So I was already torn between these two teams, and you lose Josh Simmons, who's played very well for Ohio State at their left tackle spot. I'm going to give Oregon the nod, but Ohio State, they're going to be a factor in the college football playoffs, and you make no mistake about it.
Yeah, no, frankly, I look at all these conferences. Big Ten is pretty much, I think, a three-horse race at this point. Again, I don't necessarily want to leave out Indiana because I know they're going to get on me for it. And they definitely might because I look at that offense, like they're playing a certain way that when they're on their game, like you can play good defense and they're still going to hit you because, again, Rourke's making really good throws and their wide receivers catch everything. But I still look like my eyeball's still telling me there's a little bit of a separation at the three at the top, and that's Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State. And frankly, unless Penn State blows out Ohio State, I think Ohio State's almost locked to get in that. I think Penn State's got a really, really good shot because you're not leaving a one-loss Penn State off if they do lose to Ohio State. And then Oregon, if they lose in the conference championship or something, like they're still in. So I think those three from the Big Ten are pretty much auto bids, if you will. I think where it gets really interesting is the SEC because I think there's legitimately 6 or 7 teams that can win that conference. And that to me is where you can get real wonky in terms like, well, how many SEC teams are getting in? Because in a sense, if like a Missouri comes out of nowhere or Alabama finds their way back in and gets it, you could be looking at 6 SEC teams in the playoff, I think.
Well, look at the SEC teams I left out, like Alabama, LSU. What I think it comes down to with the SEC is how much attrition do we see in this conference. You said it best. Like, the SEC is the Wild West. Like, there are a lot of good football teams that can win on any given Saturday, including teams like Ole Miss. Like, I'm fully confident that Ole Miss can beat just about anybody in the country with the talent they have on the roster. Now it's a matter if they go out and do it. I think you're going to see the SEC kind of bang each other up. And then the question is, what does the college football playoff committee do when you're talking about a 3-loss or 2-loss SEC team? You're talking about a 1-loss Indiana team in the Big Ten that certainly doesn't have the strength of schedule, but only has 1 loss. That's what it's going to come down to. But Dill, I tend to give the nod to the SEC teams. Well, how many I include here? Georgia, Texas, Texas A&M, and Tennessee. I do think we've seen the committee go to this. Like, we're going to value the teams that have played a strong schedule. And even though they might have an extra loss, we're going to put those teams into the playoffs because we think they're the better team and they've had a tougher schedule. You talk about who's going to win the SEC. I lean Georgia, and it's because of what we saw from the Georgia defense on Saturday. That's the kind of Georgia we're used to seeing winning national championships. Now, the question is, like, does Carson Beck continue to try to get back to form in 2020 from what we saw in 2023? If that happens, Georgia might be the number 1 team in the country. But at the end of the day, if Georgia's going to play defense like that, That's who I'm going to hitch my wagon to in terms of predicting the outcome of the SEC
But I would
championship.
even guess you're looking at that and saying like that's almost like a wild guess because I just don't think there's a huge separation with Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, Texas A&M, and frankly, I think LSU is right there with those. I think there's a bit of a drop off after LSU. Frankly, you look at like
I would throw.
Missouri,
You don't throw Ole
Alabama.
Miss in there. I would throw Ole Miss and Alabama into that
They're
category.
playing really bad though. Like
Okay.
Missouri, I just think those two teams are playing poorly.
Well, I ain't arguing
LSU's
for
coming
Missouri.
on, like they're starting to play some good football. A&M starting to play some really good football, and then the other three have just been kind of playing pretty good for the most part. So it's just like that to me is where it gets wonky. If one of those like teams kind of from outside looking in wins that SEC title, well, then I mean, you're not leaving out Georgia, you're not leaving out Tennessee, you're not leaving out a two-loss LSU or Texas A&M. So that's where I think it can get a little bit crazy, if you will, or get a lot of SEC.
I do think the cross conference wins for the SEC is going to help in a big way. Georgia beating Clemson badly week 1. Texas beating Michigan. I know Michigan's not great, but like Texas beating Michigan bad. Like when we've seen the SEC go out of conference, Tennessee took care of NC State again. Again, not a very good team. We've seen the SEC win, and again, I think that's more and more ammo for the committee to.
The one issue is the LSU loss because again, if LSU kind of runs through and plays really well through the SEC, that's probably the one like that's not a great loss for the conference overall.
Yeah, and the Texas A&M lost to Notre Dame, and so yeah, there are some losses to point to as well. At the end of the day, you feel pretty good about at least four teams from the SEC getting into the college football playoffs. Now the conversation is it going to be 5 or 6 and take some spots away from maybe the second team in the ACC or third team in the Big Ten.
Or Indiana.
We're going to talk about Indiana.
The other one.
We are going to talk about Indiana. Coming out of the ACC, I think it's a 2-horse race, like you said, Miami, Clemson. Now, I would encourage people to pay attention to SMU. They're playing good football. Look, I ain't convinced they're a top 12 team in the country, but they're playing better football, and they got a schedule to make the ACC championship game. So SMU, back pocket it. I do feel like SMU is going to be in this conversation come the end of November. I'm going to go with Miami winning the ACC just because I trust Cam Ward a little bit more than I do Kate Klubnik at this point, even though Clemson's offense is starting to turn it on. But I think both teams make it in the college football playoffs.
That's to me is where it gets like I almost think both are not like a lock yet, but like you kind of look. Miami, I feel like has gotten beyond their rough patches, if you will. The teams that were going to test them, like Louisville was kind of the team you're going to look up just in terms of the matchup. Like that was going to be a tough game because Louisville can move the ball, they can really move it in the air, throwing it. Miami has not really shown much of a pulse in the secondary yet. I think that was the one matchup. So you look, it's pretty smooth sailing, it feels like, for Miami until they get into that ACC title game. Probably say the same about Clemson. So.
No, you cannot say the same thing about Clemson. Clemson's had a cakewalk in the month of September and October. They're going on the road to Blacksburg. They got Pitt on the road as well. Clemson has in South Carolina out of conference, but
Clemson's getting to that mode where they beat teams that they're better than right now, and they're beating them bad like they used to. That to me is like, do any of those defenses have the ability to really like Georgia that Clemson team? And if they can't, I don't really see how they beat Clemson because again, I still look that defense is great. South Carolina, I just don't think can score on Clemson. Like I look like that. Even at its worst, like that's just gonna be like a 7-10 win for Clemson. So I don't think South Carolina is a huge threat. I think both those teams are really kind of clear waters for them in my mind.
Disagree to an extent, but I think the biggest conversation is we're going to learn how good Clemson is. Like I'm kind of with you. Like Clemson's going to wind up in the playoffs. How good and how dangerous is Clemson going to be in the playoffs? I'm going to be looking at going on the road against Pitt, going on the road against Virginia Tech, and kind of getting a gauge and playing South Carolina and how good that defense is. We're going to know how good this Clemson offense is. Like, look, I'm a Wake Forest alum. You ain't showing me anything when you put up 50 on Wake. We don't have any bodies to really test Clemson. Big 12, I went with BYU. Look, I think Kansas State.
I'm a Jake Retzlaff believer. I've decided I am a believer. I watched this game. Like, do I think the rest of that team is particularly great? No, they're going to the gun with some bad teams like Oklahoma State and some of these other games. They're just in tight ones. But this is a team that's winning a lot of football. And I do think Retzlaff's legit. I think his arm's pretty good. He runs. He's a playmaker. Like, I really like what he's brought to that team, and they're still solid on defense. That's what people I feel like maybe don't appreciate. They're really good at the linebacker spot. They're athletic and they play discipline. So
In number 2 in the
I'm a
country in
BYU
forcing
believer.
turnovers. Um, my caveat is I do think Kansas State's probably the most dangerous team in the Big 12. Like if Kansas State plays their best football, and I know Kansas State got boat raced by BYU a couple weeks ago, I think we would agree like if Avery Johnson is playing good football, that's a very dangerous Kansas State team. But I'm almost going to lean with just the BYU team that's been really consistent. I'm kind of with you, Jake Retzlaff. He's a gunslinger. He's a fun guy to watch, and he can win you some football games. I'm going to go BYU coming out of the Big 12. But that's a really hard conference to try to like pick through. All right, let's get into some of these other teams. And Dill, I want to start with this Notre Dame Indiana conversation where I think there's a very good chance that both Notre Dame and Indiana are 1-loss, 11-1 teams. Obviously, Notre Dame not playing for a conference championship. Indiana, if they lose to Ohio State, probably not playing for one either in the Big Ten. Which team gets in is going to be a fascinating conversation because both teams don't have like crazy wins. You look at Indiana, it's a great loss against Ohio State if they lose that football game. You look at Notre Dame, not so good of a loss against Northern Illinois, but Notre Dame did go on the road and beat Texas A&M week 1. Dill, I feel like Notre Dame's college football playoff hopes are tied to the SEC and how many teams get in. But I think also just as importantly, they're kind of tied to Texas A&M. Like, how good does that win look like come the end of November? That's kind of where I'm looking at with Notre Dame here. Because, again, you look at the schedule and say it, I think they should win the rest of their football games here.
Now, the SEC is definitely a big one, but I even look like, what if Indiana beats Ohio State? I think you're getting 4 in from the Big Ten. I don't think that necessarily bumps Ohio State off if Ohio State then goes out and beats Penn State. Like, I know it will look a little bit ugly, but I think you're right. The fact that Florida State's so down, USC's so down, that's pretty much taken any real argument for Notre Dame in terms of like a strength of schedule, because really all they have is A&M. So if that's all they've done and then they go lost like outright to Northern Illinois in a game where it wasn't even that fluky, like they just kind of got beat. They didn't play good enough on offense, and they really haven't been super sharp on offense, at least consistently. It's coming alive a little bit, which is obviously good news for them. I think they got to watch out if there's like a surprise upset in the Big Ten from Indiana. That to me is what gets really dangerous.
I think that's
or if a team like Missouri wins the SEC.
You need to drop the Mizzou stuff because, buddy, they ain't winning the SEC.
Fine, fine. Make it fine. Make it Bama. Make it one of those other long shot teams. Like if one of the long shots win the SEC, Notre Dame, they're out.
You're going to stick to Mizzou until they pick up that second loss, huh?
I was just using a hypothetical long shot SEC.
But I think to round out that conversation, for Notre Dame, it does feel like there's an element of, even if they only have 1 loss at the end of the year and they're 11-1, I do feel like there's an element of like what happens around them. I don't know if they're in total control of their own destiny. A couple other like teams that I'm looking at here, that Texas A&M LSU game, like I went back and like I'm back and forth on that football game in general. Yeah. And I feel like that game is
a playoff game almost.
It almost feels like a playoff game. Like whoever wins that game, I think is in the driver's seat to make the college football playoffs. And so I think that's where you have that. Tennessee is a team that they're very similar to Georgia, man. Like I think you're looking at 2 of the best defenses that you see in the country, 2 quarterbacks that have good football in them. Can they turn it on in the back half of the season? Because if they do, not only do they get into the college football playoffs, Dill, if Nico starts playing like Hendon Hooker did in 2022, I'm probably picking Tennessee to win the whole thing because this Tennessee defense is good. They're just missing a little bit of more consistency from the quarterback position. If they get that from Nico, this team becomes, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous teams in all of college football.
No arguments. No, I think Tennessee's got a really good look, I think, to get in at this point. I think they've got a couple of nice wins. I think, again, like that loss to Arkansas, I don't think it's terrible. Obviously, and played great against Florida, but I think beating Alabama, like you look, I think they're in a really good spot. I think them, Texas, Georgia, I look at really good spots for all 3 of those teams. Texas is going to be hard to knock them out. I think they get in with 2 losses, frankly. Unless it's like a bad loss like a Vanderbilt, then that changes conversation. But I look, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, I think all 3 have really good shots. Just like I think from the Big Ten, Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State all have really good shots. So I look at those 6 teams. there's got to be some real chaos going on within all 6 of them, I think, for those 3 to get bumped.
So we feel pretty good about 2 teams from the ACC, assuming it's Miami and Clemson.
Yeah.
We feel good about probably just 1 team from the Big 12, I would think. Obviously, 1 group of 5. And then it comes down to how many do they give to the Big 10 and how many do they give to the SEC. The last thing I want to talk about here, do you almost want to be the best team in the country that's a non-conference champion? Look at that 5 seed,
No,
man.
I so disagree with that. I think
Why?
you want the
Why?
buys. At that point in the season, I think you want the bye weeks.
That
You get
okay,
healthy,
that's
you get
fair.
ready. If you're a good team, I think you want the bye week. If you're a team that thinks you're gonna have to scrap and claw every game out, maybe you don't. But I think if you're a good team, you want bye weeks.
If you're Oregon and you're undefeated in the Big 10, do you throw it? Get the 5 seed, Boise State, BYU, your favorite in both by probably 2 touchdowns? Just putting it out there.
I just don't like I get that argument. I don't think that's like in your DNA. If you throw
No,
games, like I
100%. Dan
almost feel
Lanning, no one's throwing games.
but like any real coach and any real program, it's
Agreed.
like if that's like your mentality, you're gonna step out and like think, well, I'm not gonna try in this game. Then I just don't think you're like a good team. Then you might as well just punt the whole thing because like
All right.
why do anything?
Bad, stupid idea. Bad gamesmanship out of my brain there.
I know, I know the Joel Klatt theory, like, oh well, this is gonna ruin all the conferences. Like people say that about everything. I've never seen a college team not try in a football game, and it is different, but
I 100%. All right. We'll close it out on that conversation. Dill, it's a subject to change next Thursday afternoon. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.